Greetings. For this second episode of our Temperature Check webinar series, I'm so happy to welcome Lauren Riley. She's the Chief Sustainability Officer and Managing Director of Global Environmental Affairs at United Airlines. A lot of our viewers know that I'm personally very passionate about decarbonizing heavy industries like aviation, which make up about a third of global emissions combined, and whose processes require innovative solutions to decarbonize. And aviation is a particular area of passion for me, also because I have to fly a lot for work and I love to connect with the world. This is why I'm so excited to hear from you today, Lauren, about how a big player like United is really leading the way. Lauren, you're responsible for leading United's environmental sustainability strategy by progressing its climate commitments, for scaling sustainable aviation fuel, evaluating decarbonization technologies, and achieving environmental compliance. So I'm really excited to speak with you today about United and opportunities for progress and innovation in this field. So, Lauren, I think maybe let's get started by jumping right into the good stuff, because one of the things that I know motivates both of us about sustainable aviation is that importance of flying and connecting people. It's a really important part of how we build and maintain our social fabric. But today, sustainable aviation is expensive, and that's one of the main things that is holding it back. So I wanted to start by asking you how you think that ensuring this transition to sustainable aviation can be managed equitably. How do you envision airlines passing costs on to end consumers, especially those who may be on a budget or in remote locations where the cost burden is naturally higher?
Well, first, let me start by saying, gosh, it's just great to be here, to have this conversation, to talk with really, truly a thought leader like yourself about how do we go faster so that we're successful in the capacity that we all know we need to accomplish. But to your point, the challenge ahead of us is ginormous. It is really quite significant. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take all hands on deck with every lever we have at our disposal to get there. But to your point, aviation today is responsible for about 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which doesn't sound like a lot. But what I anticipate is going to happen here is that as other industries start to decarbonize, our percentage is going to increase over time. And that's because we are what you referenced earlier as a hard to abate industry. We don't have the solutions that we need at scale today to actually start decarbonizing in a meaningful capacity right now. So the real challenge, the puzzle that we're trying to put together and the solutions that we're trying to unlock really fundamentally come to how do we move the market forward faster? I mean, that's the big problem statement on the table. The world needs to connect. I think we've seen moments in time, like the pandemic and others, where we were highly disconnected, and it was not. It's not something that I personally ever want to go back to. I think there's so much benefit in that social fabric, that tissue, that connective tissue that you were talking about, for all of us to experience different geographies and cultures and opportunities, just to immerse yourselves in activities that you wouldn't otherwise understand. We all know the limitations of virtual. I love that I'm here talking to you today. It creates an opportunity for me to have a really deep, meaningful conversation. I'd love to be sitting down next to you and having that conversation and having that chemistry so that we can connect. So that ability to be side by side, to hold in touch and engage one another as we sort of really champion a change that we really need to see, that's so crucial. It really is crucial. But we have to do it in a responsible manner. And I think that's fundamentally what your question is all about, is how do we continue to connect in a manner where we know that there is an impact to climate change from that travel, which is why all of the investments, all of the activations, all of the partnerships across the value chain, all of the collaboration with policy leaders and others, which we're going to get way into because that's really the crux of the issue here, is really so important at this moment in time, because We have the solution set. That's the great news. We have the solution set. We just don't have the economics that line up to make it the preferred channel, the preferred path forward. And so we need to shift that paradigm so it becomes the preferred path forward. Yes, there will be a cost to all of this. Absolutely. But what is really cool about what's happening in sustainable aviation is that we're seeing innovations and sort of testing of different policy frameworks and a whole variety of solutioning that's happening really in those countries that are responsible for the high degree of emissions that are out there that will benefit other countries. We're also starting to see that there's job creation in these new sectors that are emerging around clean or sustainable fuels is one example, and I'm sure we'll talk lots about that too. And then, of course, there's sort of the accounting mechanism. So how do you track the numbers to make sure that we're actually pulling down? We have a lot of focus in this particular moment in time around how do we account for those reductions such that maybe some geographies don't necessarily have to have the physical assets to support a shift towards sustainable fuel. You can get it from somewhere else, and it becomes a bit of a sort of numbers game, which is not a bad thing. We actually need those numbers to collectively move us all towards a 1.5-degree pathway and align with the goals of Paris. And so we are working as a global industry to really accomplish that. And we really don't want to leave any corner of the planet behind because we need to get there together.
Mhm. You talked about so many things that I want to dig in on more. I can't wait to continue the conversation. One of the things that you talked about, kind of separating the physical production of fuel from how we account for it, I think has a lot of promise because you have a lot of corporate travelers, many companies where aviation is 80% of their total annual emissions who are happy to pay up for flying cleaner, but it's not like they need physical delivery of the fuel. So one of the topics that we think a lot about at Carbon Direct is how to kind of allocate the resources to different users that are what they really want and need.
And if I could just add real quick, that has really been such a remarkable collaboration with these corporates, because what's happening right now is we need sustainable aviation fuel. You'll hear it referred to as SAF. And for those that aren't familiar that are listening, sustainable aviation fuel is just an alternative to conventional jet fuel, big except, it's derived from waste and renewable feedstock and therefore has up to 85% less carbon on a life cycle basis. Similar product, no emissions. I mean, that's sort of the end game here. These corporate customers, these corporate travelers that you're referring to, really raised their hand and they said, yes, you're a big part of my greenhouse gas inventory because we do travel for our service, for our business. We need to continue to do so to be viable as a business, but let's take the responsible path. I mean, that's sort of the underlying theme here. And together working with them, who they have their own climate commitments. Some of them have budget assigned to really achieve those commitments. Others of them are getting real sort of gritty and sort of thoughtful in how they finance some of these transitions. But all of them are putting their hands up in the air and saying, what is the right way to do this so that we can fundamentally support a future market for sustainable aviation fuels in our actions that we take today, which has been amazing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then with those actors paying up today, the vision is that we'll achieve the economies of scale that are required to bring the cost down for others. And that's, I think, a big part of the vision for managing the future of sustainable aviation equitably, which is what we were talking about earlier. But as you know, today, even with all of that action, the amount of actual supply of sustainable aviation fuel is still too low, way too low. Forget about where we need to be for net zero at 2050. It's too low for where the industry needs to get even for 2030. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that if we look at the total production of sustainable aviation fuel last year relative to the amount of fuel that United alone uses annually, that the SAF share would be just 0.1% of your total usage.
Isn't that startling? I mean, so let me give you some
It's
real
really,
actual
really
numbers.
something to consider.
And we're, hopefully one of the leaders in the US market. And that's just,
Mhm, mhm.
it's just not acceptable. Like that's what this comes down to. That's not acceptable. In a given year, United consumes about 4.25 billion gallons of fuel. That's our operations at this moment in time. Last year, worldwide, 150 million gallons of SAF were produced. So we are really early stage. This is a nascent market. Think about wind and solar and some of these alternative renewable power 15, 20 years ago. I mean, that is where we are when it comes to alternative fuels for aviation. So we really need sort of these kickstarters, these creative financing mechanisms, these really interesting and frankly complementary policy approaches to unlock a market that is otherwise going to stay at this scale. And I think you can talk to anyone who has been on an airplane or one day will be, and everybody wants to travel responsibly and sustainably. And so we do need to take those steps forward, and we cannot afford to have another year like this next year.
Yeah, we're making progress. We just need to go a heck of a lot faster. And there's all different kinds of innovation, right? We have technological innovation, we have innovative finance. I think that there's room also for social innovation and how we lead and work together. But one of the areas of innovation that I wanted to dig in with you on, staying on the topic of sustainable aviation fuel for a moment, is innovative pathways to produce fuel. As you mentioned, there are a number of different pathways to produce it, a number of different feedstocks, different types of inputs to develop sustainable aviation fuel, everything from biomass to food crops like corn or sugarcane to oils, algae. We can even produce sustainable aviation fuel out of air, out of
Yeah.
captured CO2. But today, used cooking oil and waste fat serve as the primary feedstock for the production of SAF. And the issue that we're concerned about at Carbon Direct is, by our estimates, we think that only 6 to 8% of total fuel needs will be able to be met by these waste oils. And so we really need to start to look at more innovative pathways for production. You mentioned the role of policy, and this is, as usual, adjacent to this topic, because in the US, partially due to our policy incentives, we are seeing a lot of innovation around the development of SAF with different feedstocks, but that policy is meant for early innovation. It's not built for scale. In Europe, they have SAF mandates coming up with very high goals for SAF integration by 2030. But their policies are built for scale and not innovation.
Right.
And so I wonder what you see from United's perspective. You're flying all around the world. You're involved in innovative pathways to produce sustainable aviation fuel. You're involved in policy conversations. How do you see this all coming together?
Well, it's one big, beautiful web of sustainable options, is what I'll call it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you're absolutely right. So unlike conventional jet fuel, there's many ways to make sustainable aviation fuel. And that is from the used cooking oil all the way from the corn derived ethanol. You put gasoline in your combustion engine car, you've got ethanol blend in that gasoline. It's similar to that, all the way to this sort of captured carbon into fuel of the future. So that in and of itself creates a complexity that investors, project developers, traditional finance folks kind of get overwhelmed with, and for good reason, because it's just a lot of stuff. But we need all of that stuff to enable a transition, and that's really what I want to emphasize here. Today we have used cooking oil, as you were referring to, as the primary feedstock. That's not going to be the feedstock forever. That's the feedstock right now. There's only so much French fry oil that you can collect from the restaurant down the street. We know
Exactly.
that. But that being said, we are seeing innovations occur that are creating synthetic feedstocks, high yielding lipids, for example, which is
Mhm.
essentially, that fat or that cooking oil you're referring to, that could unlock more future feedstock for that pathway. We're certainly seeing a tremendous amount of focus in the biomass, whether that's municipal solid waste or corn, sugarcane, or other, where we're able to collect a lot of that biomass and convert it through different technology pathways. Those tend to be regional. So where is that feedstock coming from, where we can pull that feedstock and actually create it? And then, of course, I'm sure we're going to get into this because you and I are both super fans. Power to liquid, pulling the CO2 from the atmosphere and creating really what I see as a closed loop for aviation. You pull
Yes.
CO2 out of the atmosphere, you convert that using a whole bunch of renewable power, green hydrogen, and other stuff into a jet fuel that is lower carbon. Carbon comes out the pipe and you pull it back in. And so you really do have this closed loop approach. That's going to take time, and that's appropriate because that technology and the economics associated with that technology are really contingent on all of the other component parts of the ecosystem
Hmm.
maturing and commercializing and having stronger economics. So we need all of those pieces like the renewable power, the green hydrogen, all of those parts to actually reach scale so that we can ultimately benefit and not have a sustainable fuel that's 10 times the cost of conventional jet fuel. That will never take off, and that's
Hmm.
what we don't want to
Hmm.
do, which fundamentally gets to your point around policy. The Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States, historic. I mean, so amazing to see the government really put a marker in the ground saying it's
Yes.
time to change the way we fly. I mean, that's what they did. What they didn't do is sort of create the pathway or the tenure that is required for these technologies to kind of get up and moving.
Hmm.
I will tell you, since the Inflation Reduction Act at United, the amount of innovation that we have seen from startups, from early stage, entrepreneurs that are thinking about how do we unlock the potential of this market that has barely been tapped using these dollars set aside in the Inflation Reduction Act. There is innovation everywhere. It's so
Hmm.
exciting.
Yes.
But we are not seeing that move to commercialization here in the United States, not yet. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and we can talk about it. To your point, though, in Europe, we're seeing that mandate approach for the fuel supplier. You have to have a percentage of your fuel supply over time be sustainable fuels. That was designed intentionally to meet the demands of the investment and the project developer community to say, look, demand is going to stay. It is here for some time. It's not going anywhere. And so it remains to be seen if that's actually going to drive new production to market. Most of those kick in at scale early next year. So we are watching with bated breath. But we're also seeing a couple of other interesting policy mechanisms emerge. For example, Singapore, they're actually putting a levy on
Mhm.
tickets where they collect that levy and they're taking it in through the government of Singapore and they're going to use it to invest in new production of SAF. Really interesting. The UK, they have a mandate, so you have to have a certain degree of sustainable fuel that graduates over time in your fuel supply. But then they're also creating this sort of revenue guarantee mechanism or a price floor to say, okay, you
Hmm.
can sell it at this floor and no less. So combined with the mandate, that's a very strong signal. So we're all watching that. And of course, here in the United States, taking the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits and hardening them and pulling the duration on them so that we have more than 2 to 3 years for those credits so that our friends in the finance community can have confidence and find that sustainable aviation fuel financing is bankable. I mean, that's sort of the bridge that we need to cross. How do we get to a place where investment
Hmm.
in this fuel and its future production is bankable?
Yes, that is where we need to end up. You know how much I think about how we pay for all of this, in finance. But to your point, we're seeing different policy regimes pop up around the world. I think there's innovation and experimentation also going on among policymakers. There's a chance that we'll identify best practices and one country can kind of learn from the other
Exactly.
over time. But in the meantime, one thing that I wanted to ask you about, and I think about this within aviation and kind of across the board, is that in the meantime, we've got different policy regimes in different places. We, to a certain extent, have international fragmentation that can be difficult for global corporations to navigate. It's different things coming up in different regions. You're flying from region to region. I wonder, how do you feel about policy experimentation and innovation? I talked about what's exciting about it. Are there some parts of it that are also challenging for a company like United to navigate?
Oh, yes. I mean, oh, yes. As an airline, when you think about sort of what is evolving in the policy spectrum,
Mm,
there's almost three separate silos that are coming together and converging at the same time for an airline in particular. So one, as we talked about, is this movement to sort of incentivize sustainable aviation fuel adoption. And so whether it's a mandate or it's incentives for production, there's this focus on how do we specifically build a marketplace for sustainable fuels.
mhm,
The EU next year, for example, is adopting Refuel EU. United needs to comply with that. And we need to make sure that as a user of the fuel, our supplier meets the targets of the Refuel EU. Otherwise, there's costs
mhm,
associated, penalties associated with it. Every country is adopting that in their own way in the EU. Complicated,
mhm,
messy, really. And that's just the EU, not to mention all the other countries that are introducing mandates. The second silo of policy that's emerging is really around emissions. So how do we levelize or reduce emissions? And that's where things like
mhm,
CORSIA, which is a policy framework under ICAO, which is a sister company under the United Nations, which really looks at international emissions. So how do you keep emissions steady or reduced at a certain cap? We have the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme, again,
mhm,
emissions. So there's a lot of focus on the actual emissions from aviation. That's the second pillar. And then the third, which is hitting almost every industry everywhere, is ESG. And so how do you support this transparency and this sort of decision useful material, transparent sort of KPIs that year over year you made a goal, how are you doing? You say that you're committed, what are the actions you're taking? Show me
mhm,
the numbers. That's awesome. We fully support that. And we've been putting our emissions in our 10K for a couple of years now.
mhm,
But if you add all of those up, it's suddenly becoming a whole space that's highly regulated and really disjointed. And for an airline like ours that is global and really wants to progress a marketplace for sustainable aviation, it becomes more of an administrative burden than it becomes an innovative and scalable solution. And so we have to figure out how to navigate that and meet the intent of all of these in a way that doesn't stymie progress, because as we've right where we
mhm.
started, we're already not going fast enough. So that is top of mind to me, that we want to be present in all of these sort of policy frameworks that are emerging. We want to honor the intent of that, but we cannot stop progress. We have to keep going.
Yes. But of course, the regulation and disclosure is so important. It increases transparency. Stakeholders want to know, they want to partner with the leaders, but need the clear information to do so. But I have spoken with so many chief sustainability officers like yourself who see their teams today spending so much time on just reporting, and they want to make sure that they have enough time to get to the good stuff and actually decarbonize. And so I'm quite supportive of the broadened expansion of ISSB and more countries just kind of pointing back to the same thing. Those are the ISSB is the disclosure framework from the International Sustainability Standards Board. And you see different countries all around the world kind of starting to point to the same thing. We need to do
Absolutely.
everything that we can to have time to really get into deep decarbonization.
Well, and I
Um,
think their goal is really to help inform interoperability. And I think as
mm,
we keep that theme in mind, whether it's the SAF policies and mandates, or if it's the emissions focused policies or even reporting, are they interoperable and complementary, or are they bespoke and unique? The more
Mm-hmm.
unique and distinct they are, the more administratively difficult it is to manage through. And then my team is spending their precious labor hours not thinking, but doing. We need
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that we have both. We need to get it done, but we need to continue to strategically push the market forward.
Yes, we need to keep calling for this with also expressing our respect for why the disclosures are there in the first place. You talked a
Absolutely.
little bit about options for reducing aviation emissions beyond sustainable aviation fuel, which I know that we could spend the whole hour just on SAF. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the other levers that are available for decarbonizing aviation: efficiency, streamlining logistics, electrifying what we can, carbon dioxide removal. How do you think about the balance of solutions in getting United to its ultimate goal?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, if you look at United's roadmap to net zero 2050, if I recall correctly, about 45% of that reduction is going to be achieved by all of these things other than SAF. So we're
Mm,
talking about investment in new fleet. United has an order today for about 800 new aircraft. As a climate leader, that's really, really important because every new aircraft we introduce into our fleet and retire on an old one, 20% more fuel efficient, which is a direct correlation to emissions.
that's
20%
huge.
more emissions, huge, especially when we're talking about progress this decade. So
Mhm.
we are really keen to get all of those aircraft, get them in our fleet, and modernize to the best of our abilities. But we can't stop there. We really do need the OEMs, whether it's the engine or the airframe manufacturers and all of those component parts, to continue to innovate.
Yes.
You know, there's a commitment by Boeing and Airbus and GE and Rolls and all these other OEMs out there to enable engines, for example, that support 100% SAF by 2030. That will be really important because when we have a market that's robust for SAF and it's the more economical alternative to conventional jet fuel, we need engines that can really be optimized to fly in 100% sustainable aviation fuel. Those
Mm,
commitments are really material and important because not only do they allow for adoption of SAF, but they address air quality, they address contrails, some of these other
mhm.
ancillary but super important climate impact issues and environmental impact issues. So that's important. But yes, you raise hydrogen, electric, these other alternative propulsion technologies. Those are fun. Those are super interesting. I will just take a minute on those. We have investments through United Airlines Ventures in all of these different technologies because we actually believe that not only are they more sustainable, but they're actually going to provide a really interesting and fun customer experience.
Mm,
Electric could be a really good place for some of our regional destinations. So I live in Washington, D.C. If I have to get up to New York City and I can't take the train, I probably should take an electric airplane. Like that makes sense. It could be super low
mhm.
carbon, and I can get there for in a sustainable and responsible manner, as we talked about at the beginning. Um, eVTOLs, so electric vertical takeoff and landing, so sort of these urban taxi cabs.
Mm, mhm.
Um, Again, they run on electricity. If that electricity is renewable power, super low carbon impact. And that can actually take me from downtown Washington, D.C. out to Dulles so I can get my flight to London. And you can do that for roughly the same cost as an Uber or a Lyft, and it's very low carbon. So that's an example of where it's sustainable, it's responsible, but it's also providing a really fun customer experience. So we're bullish about electric in the right capacities, largely limited to
Mhm.
short distance flight. Hydrogen is one where we're seeing a lot more focus on that in Europe than
Yeah.
we are right now in the United States. I think in the United States, there's an absolute commitment with hydrogen hubs from the administration to build capacity. I think within aviation, it's largely at this point being looked at as a feedstock. So we're talking about that power to
Right.
liquid. We need green hydrogen everywhere to do that. It's so important. One day, we might actually fly in hydrogen propulsion.
Mm,
We've got some stuff to work out about flying that 30,000 feet in the air, making sure that when you land that you can actually refuel with it, you can do it safely.
mhm.
But if the infrastructure is there, absolutely we would look at that. So we do believe that those have opportunities. But then finally, to your point, operational efficiency. So one of the big issues that United is focusing on this year is how do we lightweight the aircraft? Just get the weight off the
Hmm.
plane, because the lighter the plane is, the less fuel you burn. The less fuel you burn, the fewer emissions. We're also looking at when you're parked at the gate, do you need the jet engines running?
Hmm.
Sometimes you do, but most
Hmm.
times you don't. So when you don't, turn them off, because you don't need to be burning fuel when you're parked at a gate. You can
Right.
actually have a super tug pull you back. It's powered by electricity and it can take you to the runway so that you can then fire up your jets. So those modifications in total are actually very meaningful today so that we can actually start pulling down some of the unnecessary emissions, sort of the messy emissions out there that really just don't make any sense.
Hmm. Hmm. It's really interesting. Well, first of all, I want to speak up on the fun customer experience. I'm looking forward to trying all of these things. Some of them
You and me
I'm
both.
trying already right now, it sounds like. And when I listen to you speak, one thing that I always love when I listen to you speak is I can hear this combination of what can we do now? What can we do right away? What might the future hold? And how do we plant the seeds to get there? And then just really thinking through the strategy, which is going to be a march over decades.
A
But
marathon.
I really can see a vision of the bright future that you are presenting. I wanted to take one nerd moment. So now we're going to have our nerd corner
Okay.
to, to dig in deeper on one topic that you mentioned that I've been fascinated to learn about. And I know there's some debate about it in the industry, which is contrails.
Mm-hmm.
So for our viewers who aren't familiar, contrails is short for condensation trails, and you've seen them. They're those white cloud streaks that you sometimes see trailing behind planes when they're flying at high altitudes. And this is an area of great interest because these contrails contribute to climate change because of the way that they trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere. And I know that there's a lot of research in the field of managing contrails, but some of the solutions involve changing flight paths or flying at higher or lower altitudes, which can also increase fuel usage. And so we think about how to manage the trade-offs. I know that I wanted to take time on this because I know how much our science team at Carbon Direct has done in this space, but I'd love to hear from you as a practitioner. How are you thinking about contrail management as a potential part of the solution and maybe in the shorter term?
Well, and such an important question. So contrails, not every contrail is deemed equal. So there's some
Mm,
pretty nasty contrails out there that persist in the atmosphere and they trap the heat. And then there's a whole bunch of other contrails out there that are just fine and they dissipate and they go away and everything's fine.
mm,
The contrails that we care about are those that are at certain altitudes at certain humidity levels. And those are the ones that tend to trap the heat, usually at night, in certain geographies across the globe. And those are the ones where we need to be able to figure out, to your point, A, where are they? B, will they persist, which then causes the trapping? And then C, if we
mm,
modify right now, are we causing net benefit or net damage to the climate because we're actually emitting more CO2 into the atmosphere by burning fuel, which, as you know, lasts for
mhm,
hundreds of years instead of the 24 hours of the contrail.
mm,
So what is sort of the sort of net impact on the climate writ large from doing that modification? There is a tremendous amount of collaboration going on right now across
mm,
the industry here in the US with the FAA, with NASA, with the Department of Energy to really understand the science and the climate modeling to figure out exactly where those contrails that are the bad ones form
mm,
and persist. Can we figure out with more accuracy than we have today so that we know it's worth it for us to deviate? We're also
mhm,
involved in several initiatives, research initiatives right now. For example, working with NASA and Boeing with their Eco Demonstrator project to actually test if you have SAF in one engine at 100% and conventional jet in the other engine at 100%, do you see contrails forming with the SAF engine? And the answer is yes, but materially less. And there'll be some research coming out later on this year around that. So
Interesting.
yet another benefit of the adoption of 100% SAF. We're now
Hmm.
partnering with NOAA to put sensors on some of our aircraft. So not only can we do methane detection in some urban areas to figure out where there's leaks, but we can also sense for that humidity. So we can actually start informing those models and making them smarter so that we can actually detect where these persistent, nasty contrails are and let the other ones go. So, there's a lot of discussion around what is the right engagement to address contrails such that we don't have an adverse effect that was not anticipated. The other part of the solutioning is that it's got to be a system-wide fix. So if United flies a path and we're told to deviate some degree so that we don't cause or don't hit that patch where there's persistent contrails, and we end up deviating, but the airline behind us goes right through that original path, the warming happens. So what's that compounding? If one modifies but the other doesn't, it's got to be a system-wide solution. So can we think of it in the context of air traffic control or all operators working together so that we actually do solve and don't actually make it worse because we're adding CO2 and we have the persistent contrail? We do not want that.
Right.
So there's a lot to learn, but it's so, so important. And I'm really pleased with sort of the focus on the science and the research that we can actually move to action. Like that is what it is. How do we activate a solution so that we can make sure that how we're mitigating contrail formation is actually effective?
This is really interesting. So one thing that I'm hearing is whenever I see a contrail in the sky, I don't need to worry. It's only some of them.
It's only a few of them.
And it sounds like there's active research in the space, a lot still to learn, but that this will be a part of the portfolio of solutions one day.
Absolutely. It has to be. Absolutely.
Yeah. Fascinating. So I want to shift our conversation now, making quite a shift, because I wanted to talk not just about the professional side, but also the personal side. I always say that with climate change, as we've just been discussing, we have a lot ahead of us, but we actually know in many cases what the things are that we need to do. We need to scale them up, but sometimes when I sit in meetings, I just feel that it's like we're on a leadership journey as much as a technical journey. We as leaders need to be able to sit around the table, from our individual backgrounds and abilities to contribute and figure out how to work together to really get this done. So I wanted to ask you on the personal side, what is motivating your actions as a leader today as you kind of guide yourself in this journey, and what first brought you as a leader to the sustainability field in the first place?
Yeah, that is such a great question about how to lead in this evolving space. It's just every day is different, which is fabulous and also very frustrating. I started my career in the environmental space. That's what I studied in college. I sort of just naturally gravitated towards all issues related to the environment and reducing our impact. But what I found in my first couple of years in my profession is that the way that business was talking about sustainability and the way that governments and nonprofits and the science community were talking about sustainability, they didn't speak to each other, or they tried, but it was just a different language. And
So true.
I mean, it was kind of like this, everyone was saying the same thing, but they couldn't hear each other. It was wild. And so I ended up in business school. And funny enough, when I went to business school, I'm not sure that I've shared this before, but when I went to business school, I wrote my application around the concept of corporate social responsibility and the 3 Ps with planet, people, profit. And I almost didn't get into school because they're like, we don't know what you're talking about. Like, are you talking about ethics? Are you talking about corruption? Like, what are you talking
no.
about? I'm like, no, make money doing good. Like, make money doing good. And so that was kind of fun because I needed to learn to speak the language of business. Like that was what that whole journey was about. And it
Mm,
was really sort of it was hard for me because I don't naturally think that way. But what I learned from that coming out and since having been in the sustainability field for as long as I've been is that effectively anyone who is supporting sustainability initiatives anywhere is really a change champion. Like that is what they are. That is your job. You are asking your consumers, your travelers, your executives, your board, your value chain, your government leaders, everybody to think a little bit differently about what it means to be a successful business.
mm,
That can be really great sometimes, and it can be really difficult other times. But it's all worth it because we're introducing just a different paradigm to what is traditionally looked at as, mostly financial metrics. In what does it mean to be a business that is affecting change, successful long term in a sustained manner, that has shareholder return and all that good stuff. And so I remind folks that our job is to facilitate conversation. Our job is to ask the hard questions. Our job is to really encourage big, wild solutioning, but then practical implementation. And every day you get a chance to restart that conversation because this is such a fast evolving space. But that's fundamentally our responsibility. And so there are folks that like that and they want to work with you, and then there are folks that don't. And that's okay because your job is to really challenge the business community in the whole ecosystem that it exists in to think differently and execute differently. And that takes time and grit and patience and visioning
mhm.
and relationships and really just a core commitment to why do you get out of bed in the morning? Because we do need to build towards a different future. And I believe that that future is attainable. And I actually think it's in the best interest of business. It really is. So we just need to get there. And we're starting to see those steps come into play.
Yeah. I love the way you put it. Actually, I think one of the things that really motivates me is being part of that conversation. I feel, as you said, I feel a responsibility to ask the tough questions. But I also feel that it's really a gift
Mhm.
to be able to take the inspiration and optimism that we feel and figure out how to get it practically into the world in a way that makes sense for business. I think in order to be sustainable in the long run, it does have to make sense for the private sector, which has a lion's share of the work to do in all of this. And I don't know if I've ever told this story, but actually when I was in business school, so me, one of the big things that gets me up in the morning is finance, we discussed. But I came from the nonprofit sector when I went to business
Oh,
school. So I was a career switcher into finance. And while I was in business school, I said, I want to study how to put economic and social values into traditional financial frameworks. How do we account for positive and negative externalities? There was no such course. As you said, they had already admitted me, so my application wasn't as at risk. There was no such course at the time. This was like 2001, 2002. And I got a professor to let me do an independent study on this.
wow.
And when he graded it, he gave me a very kind, good grade, but he wrote at the top of the paper, I don't understand any of this, but it's fascinating! Exclamation point. And look at where we are now.
Look at where we are now. Isn't that incredible? And you know what? Good on you. Way to be an early change champion. And I so appreciate your leadership and
Well,
everything
you too.
you
How
do.
funny that we share this experience, but now it feels like that is what the work is. If we talk to professionals entering any industry today, they would be surprised to hear about our experience. I talked about how finance is one of the things that motivates me, and I love talking with you about this topic. I think we all are becoming sustainable finance experts these days. And one of the things that we both are thinking about a lot right now specifically is project finance.
Mhm.
getting the physical infrastructure up and running for the production of solutions like sustainable aviation fuel. And it's tough. Finance is a hurdle that we have to cross to get this going. And because these solutions are so innovative, the financial structures themselves are innovated. We see things moving forward, but not at the scale that's required. So I have a fun question for you,
Okay.
which is, if you were a benevolent dictator and you had a magic wand, what do you wish that you could see from the finance sector, and perhaps policy adjacent to it if need be? What would you like to see from the finance sector that we're not seeing today to get the capital that's required?
Yeah, no, I mean, that is the question. That is the question right now. Um, if I could be pie in the sky kind of crazy right now, uh, what we actually need is a price on carbon. And I think that's
Mm.
probably the most efficient approach to unlocking capital that we would see economy wide. If I was a dictator, I don't know if I'd do that because it probably would hurt my pockets. But like, that's the point, is that you need to find a way to price an externality that we don't price. And I know there's
Mm.
lots of discussion spinning up in all pockets of the world about that. That being said, for sustainable aviation fuel, the disconnect right now is that from a project finance, infrastructure finance perspective, and yes, you're so right with your comment. We're becoming sustainable finance experts in real time. This is so not my background, but I find it really fascinating. To put shovels in the ground and to get net new production underway, we really need to sort of almost recalibrate on the expectation for hard to abate sectors specifically.
Hmm.
And why I say that is because a sustainable aviation fuel producer almost rarely, if ever, is able to hit the traditional criteria associated with project finance or infrastructure finance. You never, or not never, rarely do you have a proven management team, because this is a brand new space and a brand new market. Almost rarely do you have the operational data to show that you can continue operating for the 1,000+ continuous hours to turn out a product. There's lots of concerns around access to feedstock. So if you don't have the feedstock to go into the plant, you don't want a dormant asset. That doesn't work. So how do you make sure that that supply coming in is locked up with economics that you can carry for the duration that you plan to run that plant? And then, of course, on the demand side, I get asked all the time, and I'm certain you're going to ask me too, why can't I sign a 10-year offtake agreement for that fuel? And the answer is, we would probably go bankrupt. So what I mean by that is, today, United purchases fuel on an annual basis. That is how we procure our fuel. If you want me to hedge and sign a 10-year term for fuel, which is ultimately what this is, we don't really have the balance sheet to carry the ups and downs associated with that market. We don't know what our competitors are doing. And in a 4% margin business, that exposure is way too much for us to carry, and know that it's not going to have an enterprise-wide impact on our ability to operate as a company. And so, like, it's really truly conversations at that level. And so the question becomes, is there a blended finance approach? Can we think of some kind of untraditional stacking of different finance products that allow us to share risk differently? B, can we share risk differently? So how do we think about stepping away from these traditional criteria, such that maybe there isn't as much of a guarantee on return for the investor? It's slightly less because this is high risk, and I know there's probably solutions out there for that. That's really important for us to understand. C, from a demand point of view, can we get creative and maybe a little scrappy in how we think about demand contracts, such that it gives the confidence to the investor so that they believe it's a bankable investment? I believe there's some flexibility there that we're not accustomed to solutioning, but as I just mentioned, we're in the business of change management. We are in the business of asking those hard questions and putting those new paradigms forward. So yes, there's a different way that I think we can approach that. It's not going to happen overnight. And so finding that, the policy is limiting in the United States and we need a longer duration, B, we need to give confidence and certainty to the investor community, not just on the duration, but the value. They don't like fluctuation. So some of
Mhm,
these low carbon fuel
mhm,
standards, they're awesome. They are helping to start the market for sure. But the fluctuations that occur in the valuation, even with RFS, too much to for the finance and the capital markets to handle. And so that is probably how I would characterize the conversation right now. It's we all know the outcome we want to achieve. What are different constructs that we can put together and test to allow us to get there? Which is why United stood up our Sustainable Flight Fund. We've got a fund where there's
mhm.
22 investors across the value chain, including 4 other airlines, really trying to figure out where do we put our dollars in solutions that can help sort of build out this ecosystem so that we can have the solutions that can be scaled over time. That is really fundamentally why we're in that space. We also have a program called Eco Skies Alliance, and that's really sort of looking at that demand end of the equation. Is there a way that we can not just do annual purchase? Is there a way that we can use the power of our corporate travelers who really have been champions of wanting to invest in these solutions such that we can actually give the signal to the investment community and the project finance community that they're looking for? We haven't quite unlocked that yet, but there's sort of the makings of something amazing here. and
Mhm,
we're going to
mhm.
figure it out together. We're all going to figure it out. And I'm really excited about that.
I love the way you're thinking about this, and I agree with everything that you've said on looking at blended finance solutions. One of the things that I've been saying is bankable offtake is also part of the capital stack. It's at the table very much. There have been some deals that have come forward where airlines' demand signals have really helped to get the deal done. And United is active in this, but as we've said before, we just need to see so much more of it. We've been so lucky to have you here today. I hate to have to stop here, but we're running out of time. As we go, I want to just come back again on the personal front. One reason I love to speak with you is because you're so optimistic, and I'm always learning something new. Is there anything that you find helps to support you personally on this path? Just to keep you in such positive spirits day to day?
Well, I love that question. I have to say, I don't know if I'd call myself an optimist. I think I'm a pragmatist. I am very practical in how I see things and how I expect. I believe sort of change can happen, and maybe you need a little bit of all of that. But fundamental to most of this, you do need the grit to just keep going, like
Yeah.
just keep going. Um, I cannot express enough how amazing and really uh, just extraordinary the innovation has been here, at least in the US, since the Inflation and Reduction Act was passed. I have no doubt that we will have the tools in the toolkit. I have no doubt.
Mhm.
It's really incumbent upon us to create a market. And how do we do that? How do we come up with the right incentives broadly so that we can shift expectations towards the more sustainable alternative? That
Mhm.
is so solvable. It is so solvable. It's it's going to take time, and it's going to take the right leaders, and it's going to in corporate and government and all the way around to really continue to sort of push and shift the expectation. And if
Yeah.
we get there, when we get there, it's going to be amazing because it's frankly just going to be a better place to live. And there's going to be, really great innovations and solutions everywhere that are going to be cleaner for the planet, that are really going to be more beneficial for future generations. And
Yeah.
I do believe that. And so continuing to sort of push, because this is unacceptable, sort of the space we are in right now. We can be so much more. And a lot of the momentum I've been seeing from leaders like yourself and others that are continuing to say, let's unpack this so we can build it right. Um,
Hmm.
that to me, that's what gets me out of bed and makes me so excited about the future.
Love that. Let's stay at it together.
I love that too.
It's always such a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for joining, and I can't wait to continue our conversation.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been great.